Welcome back to part two of our multi-part series here, where we're talking through the four different parts or four different styles of, exiting a business. This kind of goes together with the four-part blog series that we put out, which is breaking down the different type of deals that you can
Mhm.
exit a business with. Today, we're going to be digging pretty deep into third-party transactions and ESOP transactions. So thanks for joining today, Chris.
No, I've been looking forward to it. This is great.
So where should we start? Do we want to start with the ESOP transaction? Kind of, I know that's one that probably most
Yeah.
people aren't familiar with. So do you want to kind of start there?
Right. Obviously, ESOP is an acronym. If you read the blog post or if you already had the background knowledge, it's an employee stock ownership plan or program. And it's honestly, it's kind of this hybrid transaction. It's a third party transaction because technically the new owner is a new entity. It's a trust in a sense or a plan, which has its own legal entity associated with it. But then the actual participants and the owners of the stock are the employees of the company. So it's this hybrid transaction that gets done very infrequently. It's one of the least executed transactions in the market. There are some pros and cons to it still, but typically the cons outweigh the pros for the seller who's looking to sell. And oftentimes those cons just have to do with the legal complexity, the employees that are a part of the company, possibly the type of employees that are there. They could be transient, there could be a lot of churn, depending on what the type of company is. And then also they're just very expensive because there's the ongoing administration and maintenance of these plans and also the setup. So, you know, there's enough to be, just a cursory overview of employee stock ownership programs or plans, and we wrote about it in the post in the article, but they are one of the least executed transactions out there over time.
No, that makes sense. It sounds to be like they're pretty tailored for the deal too. So it's not something that they're going to be able to hop online and like be able to structure one of these or put it together. So that's something that you're
Hmm.
definitely going to have to probably deep dive and look at the deal specifically if you were to
Yeah.
help somebody through that.
Yeah, and there are requirements that your company has to make in order to even enter into them. Size requirements, both employee size and revenue size. So, there's enough out there online for our listeners to do a little bit more research if they, might be interested in addition to the article that we put out. But yeah, they are one of the least executed third-party transactions.
That makes sense. Well, I'm glad we got through that. Now we get to the actual fun part, the deal the style that probably
So,
most people are interested in. So
mhm.
third party transactions, that's kind of the bread and butter of the M&A world, right?
It is. That's, when you think mergers and acquisitions, it's oftentimes you're merging with a company that's not anything associated with yours or being acquired, or in a lot of ways too, this world that we operate in is misnomered. We call it M&A, but it's really a lot of times we're serving the sellers and it's a divestiture, it's a sale. But it's the most executed transaction is the third party, both public across all types of markets, public and private.
Makes sense, especially when you dig in and realize and see some of the benefits of it. It to me, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense why you would do something, or why you would
Yeah.
go that way. So looking at third party sellers coming in, they're bringing the business. What would you say the number one advantage of a third party transaction to just your typical, they've worked in their business for 5, 10 years, growing it. What's the number one benefit for going this route?
It's a lot of these benefits actually go hand in hand, but usually the biggest reason why entrepreneurs, business owners, and sellers of companies look to sell to a third party is because they want the highest sale price for their company, just period. That's just full stop why they enter into this type of a transaction and ask people like us to represent them to go out and find that best transaction and that highest sale price.
That makes sense. So we're,
Hmm.
yeah, we're all good-hearted, but we're also all looking for the biggest payday possible. So
Yeah, yeah, it's the asset. It's the biggest asset, the most valuable asset financially, anyways, that most people own if they have a company.
yeah, no, I can believe it. We spent more
Hmm.
time on that, and it certainly was, the most valuable asset to date that we've ever, that we've ever built or sold even. So
Right.
that makes sense.
Yep.
So, and how, like, what is different about a third party where you can get a higher valuation on that versus, say, like on our last podcast that we talked about the family or the management buyout? So, kind of
Yeah.
what drives that higher valuation in a third party network?
Right. That's the question. And you saw this, I think, with your transaction, is that you're really going out to what we call the market, and you're interacting with the largest pool of potential buyers to both price the transaction and to find the interest, to get a read on what the market believes the company's worth. And then ultimately you're finding that highest sale price. And by virtue of, if you have, multiple parties that see value there, you can play them off of each other. So in a sense, you're creating that auction like situation where the value is really strong because you have multiple parties interested.
Oh, that makes sense. I think even for us, we definitely saw this even outside of valuation, which we did see that with the competing offers from different people. But like there were different transitions as
Mhm.
well. So even though some of them weren't necessarily a monetary valuation increase, but like certain buyers wanted us to stay around for a year or run the warehouse or do things like that. So like so
Uh-huh.
there was benefits in in this structure as well for us because we were able to kind of go with the shortest time frame as where we were out within like 90 days, where if we would have had to say employee buyout or something along those lines, where maybe we'd have had to stay, or a family buyout where we would
Right.
have to stay around a lot longer, but we were able to find
Hmm.
value in that as well.
That's actually a really good point, because I think in saying what's the greatest pro to selling to a third party, we say the highest sale price. If we say the highest value, it really brings in some of these other elements that you're referring to. And in your case, you highly valued, your I called it location independence. And so you were really tied down to the warehouse and you were looking to be free from that through the transaction as quickly as possible. And so, that works. And it's often the case in deals where these things, these structural features work together with others to create the highest value in the eyes of the seller.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense. And we definitely witnessed it firsthand because we wanted the highest dollar amount, but we weren't gonna agree to hang out and run the warehouse for the next year or two as
Hmm.
well. I don't remember exactly how many offers we got, but it was so interesting to see all the different like um one valuations, but two like clauses, if you will, like the transition out of the business, and everybody had a different
Yeah.
mindset on it. So that was
Hmm.
very eye-opening where selling a product, it's like, okay, it's $20. It's $20. That's it. There's no negotiations. There's no like,
Yeah.
oh, well, and I'll put all these riders on it. So it was cool to see.
Yep.
Um,
With your selling to the greatest number and the greatest pool of potential buyers, and the third party transaction really leaves a lot of flexibility too in how you go about doing that. You mentioned, like, I don't remember how many exact, offers that you had. I remember, but it was, but I was thinking too that, creating demand for the company is our job. And we try to bring in as many interested parties as possible all at the same time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end of it either. And so there's a lot of options. I remember during that time period we would do things like kind of have like whisper talk among certain parties that deals were coming, and try to really gin up interest and excitement about certain ones with the buyers that we knew that were focused on those company targets like yours. And then you can stage it out and you can really run it in these sort of customized ways to generate as much, the interest and the hype and the demand for it ultimately at the right time.
too. No, that makes sense. Your Rolodex has got to be quite valuable. I remember before we went to market, like just like, oh, saying some of the people that you maybe expected an offer from or that would likely be interested. And you're like,
Yeah.
really? And then, sure enough, we got offers from those people. So some of the, I was like, I didn't even know
Hmm.
they did that. So yeah,
Yeah.
that Rolodex has got to be quite valuable. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's funny because that is usually when you ask business owners, entrepreneurs, people that are considering selling their business, where they see the value in using an advisor. And most of them will say that first, that they are the ones that can find the buyers and find the right buyers. And if you have like a greater exposure to a pool of buyers, that's where a lot of the value comes from. And there is a lot of value in that. But I always like to tell clients that that's about a third of the work, when it comes right down to it. There's so much else that goes into running a third party transaction that is, even just beyond finding the buyer, but that is a really key piece of it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think probably just speaking from the seller side of it, like I don't run in a circle of too many areas that these guys or know people that have just millions of dollars to like
Yep.
buy companies with. So
Yep.
that's always the most daunting thing. So, and then once, to be honest, like once you get the offer, like then you're like, okay, well now what? And that I think
Yeah.
that's where like some certainly more, and we were able to lean on you and help us through that.
Yep.
But yeah, the getting in touch is kind of first. It reminds me of like Remy going after chasing or my old dog Rocky. He like chased the birds here in Florida like every day, and then finally he caught one. He had no idea what to do. He just like dropped it and just took off running away from it.
Yeah.
Like he
Yeah.
never actually got it. So it makes sense.
Well, that's kind of a great analogy too, because as a business seller, as an owner and someone who's looking to sell their company, a lot of times you catch a bid. You catch a buyer out there that might show interest. You're at trade shows all the time. You're in contact with your own market. It might be a competitor. And these people are coming to you because that you have a good reputation. And if you were ever interested in selling, they would be interested in talking. So you get a hold of one of these things. And that, like I said, it's not uncommon. It happens all the time. But if you're looking for the highest sale price, usually it's not in your best interest to go with that party right away. There's usually a way to play that so that you can still achieve both.
Too. That makes sense. I mean, I know looking to buy anything, like as soon as somebody lists something for sale, like I just think about a house, for example. When they list it on the market for sale, you're thinking, okay, they're going to get top dollar for that, or what the highest valuation they can. If you're the buyer and you see a house and your neighbor's moving out or whatever, and you want to get a good deal on it, you approach
Hmm.
them before it's listed. You approach them before they have
Right.
professional help essentially, and
Yeah.
that's how you can get a better deal as a buyer. But we're
Right.
repping the sellers, so that's not exactly what you want to do.
Right. And that's something that, we get a lot. We'll have clients that come and they have a handful of buyers already that they're speaking with. And they've been having good discussions. Usually it's the case that they still need to run their company though, which is very hard to do a third party transaction and run your company simultaneously to make sure that it continues to operate, at peak. But, I always let people know, look, the best way to keep these people honest and to make sure that what you're hearing is legit is to bring in other parties.
So,
And so there's a way to do that, a tactful way to go about that, a professional way to go about that. And look, they should expect it, quite frankly. It's not like you're going to offend anybody. This is business.
yeah, and if they would get offended and walk away, what are the chances that's the best offer anyhow? You
It
know what I
was
mean?
right,
Like they're trying to
right.
buy something. We have one of our houses for sale now, and we literally got an offer, kind of one of those pushy kind of offers, maybe something like this of like literally half of the asking price. But if we don't
Mhm.
accept now, they're walking. I'm like, you can do more than walk, bud. So, but probably somebody out there has fallen for that and said, "Oh, you know what I mean." So,
Right, right.
but no, that makes complete sense. So when you take a business to a group of buyers, or when you kind of put it out in the market and you play them against each other, are you, you know, for just the extreme circumstances, are you calling one and saying, "Hey, they offered me 5 million, you need to up it," or like, how do you really kind of pit two buyers against each other to really drive up the price or the valuation of a business?
Yeah, that's where the art comes in a lot of this because sometimes you can run a transaction where you have a process and you put out what's called a process letter to all of the parties that you distributed the materials to that are under, confidentiality, and you let them know, you've got 2 weeks to review the materials. We're expecting an initial indication of interest by this date. We expect your offer to contain, one, two, three, four, five things in it. Please do these things, and we'll be looking for your information by that date. You know, Sometimes they don't work that way. The business could be a little bit more specialized. And so it's important to kind of go out and as you go, be able to leave yourself flexibility to negotiate. And usually, the best thing that you're able to do as you're negotiating is just being straightforward and honest. I mean, one thing that always works is just letting them know like that the seller won't take anything less than a certain amount. But it is, once you have either those initial indications, you can let the parties know. You have to compare all of them, and you can let the parties know that aren't going to win. And then the ones that do, they enter into like a second phase of the transaction in which they know they're in competition. And that's the key piece is, sometimes you're playing poker and you're holding a pair of twos or nothing. And sometimes you got a pair of aces or better. And so that's the key piece. But I think, when they understand that they're in competition, and usually my experience has been that the buyers actually are very straightforward. They're very straightforward too about like why they want the asset, what they're looking to do. They're not trying to pull one over. They are trying to get the best, deal. But when you're an institutional buyer of sorts, whether that be a private equity firm, a family office, if you're a company making a strategic acquisition, you're not looking to flip these things. And so your thesis is more than just a year. It's probably at least 5. And so they understand that they're buying this and that, haggling for, specific dollars isn't the goal here. The goal is to get the asset if they like it.
So that makes sense. Yeah, because it's step over, what is it? Step over a dollar to save a dime or something like that, I think
Hmm.
it's saying. So that makes
Yeah.
sense. I guess you could probably use the buyers to keep each other honest as well. Like maybe there's something one buyer doesn't like, tries to make a big deal about it. But
Right.
if they know that there's somebody else that's just waiting, or, maybe negotiating at the same time, then they have to probably ask themselves, okay, how big of a deal is this?
Hmm.
Have you ever seen that like in deals where, kind of just this simple fact that because they know there's another party at the table where they're more willing to negotiate or more willing to kind of like, move forward with the deal?
Yeah. Well, I think it just depends. I mean, we saw it both ways. A lot of times people are just looking for value, and those type of buyers don't like the competition. So they'll in some cases remove themselves. They'll disqualify themselves from the deal if they don't want to be in that type of scenario, which is fine. There are lots of different perspectives that come into play here. But as you were alluding to earlier, there's a lot of different points in a transaction that get expressed in a letter of intent and then ultimately in the deal transaction documents. And all of those points, there could be literally hundreds of different points can come into play. And where the seller's putting weight definitely creates a leverage, position if we know that one buyer is more flexible than another. You probably saw that in your own deal, actually, especially when it came to the transition.
Yeah, yep, we really did. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, I legitimately feel like we accepted the best offer all around, like highest valuation, the best earnout stability, the best transition. Like it's not like we had to sacrifice a valuation for a better transition or something like that. I really feel like I mean, they they won on all aspects, and so
Yeah.
it was kind of a crystal clear decision for us, that's for sure.
Hmm. Yep.
But
But I think
uh,
one thing that helps with these deals in selling to a third party is, when you have an advisor that sees these things and sees so many of them, that, if you have, like in your case, you had multiple buyers at the table simultaneously, and they're all expressing it a little bit differently. And being able to then not just talk about the ones that are in front of us, but know where we can push and possibly change things to make one better. If you're favoring one, make it more of a clear winner, or improve another one in some various aspect that it's lacking. A lot of times with consumer products companies, for example, buyers will try to include a lot of working capital more than necessary. So there's various things that you can lean on, but having somebody who sees it all basically and sees the market on a regular basis can really help you parse through that information.
no, that makes sense. It was definitely that way for us. It wasn't just a $1 amount, like, and that's your deal. Like, there's so many pieces to it. So, kind of like moving those all around and understanding. No, that makes a ton of sense. I know something that we had talked about when we were, going through our deal and stuff back then was we wanted to see it grow and we wanted to see
Mhm.
the company succeed after we sold it as well. And that was
Yeah,
something that we felt like going with a third party would provide it. They have their expertise or
yeah.
their networks built out already. So how common is that, or where the sellers are really kind of wanting to see the company, obviously you want to get paid, but
Right.
where the growth after the transaction really matters.
It's yeah, it's a good question because the answer is you see it all the time. I mean, it's kind of a cliche that we often refer to entrepreneurs' companies as their babies. But I think somebody who doesn't have a company or a small business, if they're listening to this, maybe can't understand that motivation that you're talking about beyond just getting the big check, the payment
Right.
for the company. But when you consider how much time and effort and risk went into creating this asset, and the idea that it could become something more, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're selling it, is somebody else sees value to take it forward. If there wasn't that growth potential, there would be a probably zero probability that this would be selling.
Right.
So you see it in every deal, actually. I do. I see it in every deal. They want to see what they created go on. They want to see it in the right hands. And then there's other things related to the present company too that come into play, like employees.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. Like, it's like an artist painting a painting and then watching it get destroyed down the road. Like, yeah, technically you sold it, but you still don't want to see that.
Mm-mm.
I mean, I'd love to say it was all purely based off of it being our baby, but for us too, there's like there was monetary benefit to see, put placing the company in the right hands. So like in the form of an earnout or a stability payment where like we really want to see it succeed because
Mm-hmm.
we
Yeah.
actually get benefit, we get financial benefit if the company grows down the road as well.
That's true. Yeah, the growth that a third party can bring is part of what gets you paid more in those types of structures. Whether it's like you said, there's earnouts, one interesting feature of the deals like that were associated with your transaction were these stability payments, which were just a way of making sure that the business remains stable for a certain period of time. We
To
didn't
do.
necessarily need growth. And then the other that's very traditional in third party transactions are when you don't sell 100% of the business at that point in time, but that you retain a piece. Would absolutely want to see that growth, right? So
Right.
you would have a chance at that second transaction later.
So, hopefully, ideally, in the perfect world, they continue to grow it, and whatever chunk you left in there, maybe
Yep.
if you're really lucky, grows to be even larger than what the first part you sold was. So,
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
form of monetary wise.
That's right.
For somebody looking, somebody retiring, right? Somebody 50s, 60s, whatever it may be, looking to retire. What do you typically see is the fastest for them out of the business? Like if they don't want to spend, maybe on a family deal, maybe they'll, 5 years it's going to take to pass this business over.
Yeah.
Like what's the fastest that you see generally in forms of these types of deals? Which one's the quickest way for the owner to actually fully be removed?
It's usually a third party transaction with a company or with a buyer that has a strategic interest already. They're already involved in that type of a business. So as you can imagine, if you have two similar companies merging, there would be a lot of redundancy there. And it's likely they call it a strategic portfolio company if it's a private equity firm, or it could be a corporate strategic where it's just a company making an acquisition to grow or diversify. But the likelihood it's just high that there's already somebody there that knows what they're doing and that have been in that seat for a while that represents the buyer. The buyer's comfortable with them, and what you'd be needed for is mainly just transition of relationships, key relationships, that are relevant to your specific company, which in that case might only take, you know, sometime less than a year to really, and phasing out over time. It's not like you're 40 to 50 to 60 hours a week straight in, but it just phases out over time.
Right. Yeah, ours was, I want to say, like, give or take 90 days pretty much from, like, the check getting deposited to the last truck leaving the warehouse. Now we had some,
Yep.
like, 1 hour Zoom calls every week or something for a little bit longer, but like the brunt of the work was gone. I mean, after about 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yep.
a odd feeling the first day you woke up and you're like, I mean, for I don't know how many years it was wake up, same routine like Groundhog's Day, and you're going to the warehouse and you're printing the labels. And like for a year after, I think I had the sound of a thermal printer, that little sound it
Oh
makes,
yeah.
like
Yeah.
burned
Just
into my brain. I think I would dream about it or something.
yeah.
Um,
Yep.
very,
Yep.
very quick. And that was super important to us as well. I mean, I wanted out of the warehouse as well, but especially Alicia. And then she got to be able to travel, that all opened back
Right.
up for us. It was cool to go from being able to just be back on your laptop and, being able to work from anywhere.
Yep.
But
Yeah, no, you guys, it's hard work. And that's probably why it stands out to you so much, doing the hard work of being consistent day to day, moving lots of cardboard around, shipping, receiving, packing, making sure the FedEx guy or the UPS guy gets I mean, it's just the same things day in and day out, but that's what it took
to
to
do.
scale it over time. You did it. And I mean, you probably remember to the day how many days it took because you were doing it.
Yeah, and it was you actually got to be friends with all the drivers and like your warehouse neighbors, and it was like
Yeah.
it was certainly fun, and we absolutely enjoyed it while it lasted. But then, then we bought the motorhome and we were kind of sad. And then I think somebody I know has told Alicia that that's quite a tissue that she can cry into now. So I don't know who would say that to her, but
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh yeah, we'll get the motorhome and we'll travel the US. All right, we don't miss the warehouse so much anymore.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
no,
That's funny.
it was a nice quick, quick transition afterwards, which was great for us.
But they
Now,
need, sometimes it's longer than 3 months. I think typically something between 6 to 12 is, I think, standard where there's a pretty quick exit, I think,
you
for a
do.
founder, for a seller.
Right. And I'm sure it all depends on what you're doing. And where with us, warehousing isn't the most complex of tasks. You scan in, scan out. So
Yeah.
they were able to move that. That was our big, like, that was the biggest thing that took like location requirements. But certain businesses, or, depending on your staffing and, very different models for different businesses. But
Right.
that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, it can't be all roses. Like the most common in what we've talked about, the third party transactions and in many ways the most lucrative. But what are some downfalls to doing a third party transaction, excuse me,
Yeah.
versus say a management buyout?
Well, as you can imagine, if you're doing an MBO or even just selling the company to junior, you're still going to have a fair amount of control, and they're going to be looking to you for that help, as it transitions. When you sell to a third party, one conversation that I usually have with every client along the way is that person expressing, their perception that they're going to be working for someone else after the deal's done for a period of time. And usually that's not the case at all. It's just a thought and a perception that they have, but it's not unfounded, because the reality is that, when you hand over the keys in a majority sale, you don't have the say that you used to have. They might look to you still because you're the expert on this, but you don't have the same say that you used to. And so you lose control. And a lot of founders can, they feel that, and it comes along with, like you said, you get a big payout, but you don't have the influence anymore that you used to in the company. And if you still own a piece of it, especially, or you're looking for that earnout, it's time based, as well as, hitting certain thresholds, that can be hard because you're no longer in control of getting there. What was your experience with that?
Well, the first thing that just resonated to me there, Alicia and I are about to get married here in a couple months, and I was like, yeah, I guess when you sign up, you do lose control, huh? I'm thinking about that. I was like, wait, are we talking about weddings here?
Oh
I'm
no.
not gonna have the decision-making power anymore. She's taken over, but no, it was exactly that, where it was they were very cordial and like, it was a smooth transition at first, but then, a little bit into it, they started to go one way and we're like, I wouldn't do that. Like,
Yeah.
and you try to provide the best guidance you can, but we had
Yep.
sold, we exited, and you have to be
Yep.
able to relinquish that. But it's just one of those things where we give our opinion and we try to, guide them, but they bought the company and it was not like a
Hmm.
hostile, it wasn't like you're, a horrible boss who calls you up and is yelling at you. They just say, hey, we want to try this. And in
Yep.
some aspects, it was kind of interesting for us to see because when we owned it, it's certain as we got closer to the sale, your risk appetite decreases a little bit. You're not going to go out and take this massive, try to pivot the business 180 kind of swing. You're
Yeah.
just really
Yeah.
trying to work towards that. So it was interesting for us to see from the inside of like, oh, maybe that will work. I don't think it
Hmm.
will, but
Yeah.
so yeah, but it wasn't a hostile environment or anything like that. It's just
Hmm.
at the end of the day, you're going to give your opinion, they'll listen, but if they choose to do something else, then you just kind of, okay,
Right.
let us know how it works.
Right. And even though I believe you had a formal transition agreement or transition services agreement, which is very common, it's a separate document. It lays out what the responsibilities are over time, even, and how that phases out. It can phase out over time. The responsibilities are very clearly delineated, but I think that there's a professional courtesy that's always there. There's a deference, that comes into play because they understand that built this thing, you certainly know something.
Right.
And I don't know, I mean, you speak for yourself, but I don't think that you ever, and it's usually not the case, that you ever feel like you're working for a boss, that
No.
you now have a job,
Yeah,
after you're done. Yeah.
exactly. No, no, it's never that way. And actually, I mean, you that was the easiest work we've ever done in our entire lives. We've had so many jobs, before, or, whatever. Like that's the easiest. And even like it was just amazing. The first or second day going into the warehouse after we sold,
Yeah.
not that we didn't care, but it was just like if the computer crashed and the printers broke, you're like, okay, no big deal. But like, when we're
Right.
going through and running the business, you're generally stressed more. And like I saw this with multiple people,
Yeah.
maybe employees, maybe strategy. There's a lot of different things that you're juggling.
Hmm.
And now with that transition or with the kind of the exit complete, yeah, it never felt like a job. Like it was actually kind of fun for us for a while to talk to them because they had all had different business experience in some way, shape, or form. So,
Yeah.
like it was kind of cool just to go through that. But no, we never minded it. And they actually even let us go early because they had kind of taken
Yep.
everything over, had their team in place, and they're like, all right, nice meeting you. Take care, guys.
Yeah.
We could have certainly stayed around if we wanted, but they just said, we got it from here. But yeah, it was very never felt like a job, and we never dreaded those phone calls kind of deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and I think that is the experience in the vast majority of the cases that I've been involved in. And a lot of that is finding the right partner, honestly. When we talk about the greatest pool of potential buyers, I mean, there's a cultural fit also that a lot of times has to come to bear. But, making sure that, you know, works for both parties, especially for the seller, is important. And I like to always tell my clients that there's a huge opportunity with a transaction that if you're not selling with something else in mind, like a lot of times, retirement is in view, or if there's something health related where maybe you don't have the capability that you used to have. But if you still have your strength and you're still willing to kind of get up every day and lace up. There's a new adventure that potentially is coming out with this deal. And a lot of times it takes the form of like an advisory role to a financial buyer that's looking to scale this thing. And not only that, but make additional acquisitions in the space.
so that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I know I've talked to some people personally that they had like, their agreement ended up getting extended longer. I mean, by their choice, but
Yeah.
we're giving an opportunity there, I guess.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
they actually came back and hired Alicia for some consulting work after our deal was done too, because they wanted some help after the deal.
Nice.
It was, I know for us too, which I guess this could be a pro or con, but is the transition of employees, depending on how many employees you have and how
Oh,
important that
right.
is to you.
Hmm.
But that's maybe somewhere where a third party can differ from, say, a management buyout or even a family buyout.
Yeah, there's a lot more security, I think, on the part of the staff. And there isn't an incentive in those other types of structures to keep them in the dark, honestly, as long as possible. Because the truth is a lot of times you don't have the answers and they're just going to be full of questions.
To do.
But losing control post close over those people and what happens to them can be, way heavy on the minds of sellers, and that can be perceived as a negative in a third party transaction, and even to the extent that in certain international jurisdictions like in Europe and the UK, there's also labor laws that come to bear and additional financial components that are owed to and for over a certain amount of time. So it can make, it just all these things come into play,
To
but
do.
they can be viewed as negatives. Yeah, and a lot of times they're perceived negatives.
Right. Yeah, no, it was definitely questions we had, through it, but it was maybe, I guess it all depends on the complexity, how many people and what kind of buyer you're getting. But I think
Yeah.
Sometimes they're buying it because of what is working, and that is the team in place now. So sometimes I'm sure you'll see where the entire team, if they want an opportunity with the new owner, they have it. Not always, but I'm sure you see a lot of deals like that as well.
Actually, I'm really glad you said that, because that is true. If it's There are conditions that make that true. Like, one example is a financial buyer purchasing a type of company for the first time. They need the team to come with it. Versus if it's the third deal that they're doing in the space, they might not need all of the team. There's more redundancy there. But, owning a company, you understand that your people are an asset to you, in the operations of the business, and the buyer sees that the same way.
That makes sense. And I know for like one of our employees, they actually had the opportunity to grow after we sold, they kind of like stepped into a little bit bigger shoes. So
Mhm.
like it was a plus for them. So I mean, it can go either way. It can certainly be a negative, but it could, depending on how important it is and what the entire deal looks like, it could end up being a positive for the deal as well.
Yeah, completely.
But no, that makes
Yeah,
sense.
right.
Now, I guess probably one of the biggest differences and between say this and selling to your son maybe or your daughter or something like that is kind of the negotiations of the deal itself. Like,
Hmm.
would you say these are, where on the terms of complexity and negotiations and kind of, from the offer to getting the deal done, where does this fall in terms of difficulty?
The third party transaction will have the most complex negotiations of any of them. The ESOP is complex in its own way, but it isn't a negotiation necessarily in the same way that a third party transaction is. And there's so many points that to negotiate. And not only that, but the people think, it's not just through the letter of intent that you're negotiating. You're negotiating what they call the heads of terms, or the high level points, or the term sheet for a transaction there. you know that's just the surface. And as you work your way through the definitive agreements in these transactions, everything from, as you can imagine, we were just talking about transition services and what role the founder might have post close, to how reps and warranties and indemnifications and transactions are going to be expressed, and what might be negotiated in those points in the deal. There's ongoing negotiations all the way up until the close. And it's really interesting, because if you want to say, just for this discussion, there's 100 points to be negotiated, you will spend the most time and the most stress and emotional energy on those last two or three, hands down.
Really?
Right, yeah, right up to the close, in most cases.
To do. No, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah, I feel like our last, I don't remember exactly, but I would say our last kind of like bullet point was within a few weeks of close, the last kind of as they went through due diligence and, and then because I mean, the business was still operating for a couple months during that and things were changing, new products, stuff like that. So, but yeah,
Right.
it certainly it felt like it was down to the last minute, and then you just never know. Like we were not that we always thought the deal was going to fall through, but you just didn't know, like until you actually have the check in your hand. So um
Right.
that's where we definitely were thankful to have you there, Chris. What are we doing? What are we doing? What's the and sometimes it was just a question, but I guess if they just asked a question, then you start to,
Right.
why are
Why are
they
they
asking that?
asking?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What are they looking for? What's wrong? Did I make a mistake? And
Right.
90% of the time it wasn't. It was just, that's where it was great to have you to lean on there because you're like, oh, they're just asking questions, they're just looking, but it was kind
Hmm.
of like you're so close to the finish line, you're like, don't screw it up here.
Well, and think about it. I hate, these are the things that can keep people up at night. But when you're that far into a transaction, from the point that you maybe have signed a letter of intent, gotten through the exclusivity period, there could be an extension or two related to that, just because it takes time to get through complex deals and negotiation and documentation. You could be anywhere from 60 to 90 days into it at that point. And the seller, I'm sorry, the buyer in most cases, unless there's some restrictive clauses that are put in place, like breakup fees and such, you know, doesn't necessarily have to close it. And so that's another piece of why it's so important to be working with advisors, I think, that you can know and trust and that have your best interest in mind. That I mean, one of the biggest reasons why deals could fall apart and even get renegotiated down the stretch is because the seller's kind of taken their eyes off the ball, and they've stopped running the company like they were never going to sell it. And that's something that a buyer can take advantage of right up to the, final hours.
too. No, that makes sense. There's no way we could have done it because we were kind of in busy season. We're growing. Like, I mean, it was just so much going on. And it was like sometimes overwhelming, even like just to have calls to talk about stuff because you're like, yeah, we can do that in between these two containers arriving today and shipping all these orders. So, like, if I
Mhm.
would have had to be dealing with them directly on every little question and every bit of that, it would, yeah, you would have noticed it on the P&L, or you would have noticed it in our sales because we wouldn't have had time to try to do it all ourselves.
Right. And so, sometimes what I come across are people that think that they can get deals done just using their attorney, for example. I've got a captive buyer here, and that's who I'm going to go with. First, they don't really know that they're getting the best price, but then second, they think they could just, all I need is someone to pay for this at
So,
this point. But you're really talking to someone now that doesn't understand the company and doesn't have the background with you, the seller, to be able to really be your representative. It's not to say that we speak for you, but we certainly can articulate your thoughts, and what we understand are the deal terms, because we've had the most exposure prior to that with the buyer. And we have all that history, and then we have the history of even understanding your company before it went to market. That those are the things that really make the difference down the stretch in keeping the buyer honest, keeping their confidence level very high, making sure you're able to continue to run the company like you're never going to sell it, and then getting it closed as quickly as possible.
no, that makes sense. Yeah, I know it was kind of felt like for us, it was like you just became an extension because the interviews, the recordings, the everything where it's like, a few weeks into working together, you could have and probably did, talk about it like you were there the entire time. Like you knew like the product selection, the story, the everything that kind of made the business you had understood. So we had no idea what that process would look like, but
Yeah.
think you killed it with that and you did awesome. So
That's honestly, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but that's really one thing that I really like so much about what I do, is that I get to see a lot of different types of business models and people. I always say I get to work with the most successful ones, because you got to this point, you got your company to this point that you can sell it, you have the opportunity to sell it. But, I've when I look back and I think about all the different types of revenue models and business types that I've sold, everything from healthcare companies to software to consumer products to education, that's what keeps me interested, and that makes what I do really, exciting.
no, that makes complete sense. I was just thinking every Christmas, like growing up, my grandpa would always have those puzzles, the bent nails and stuff. I don't know if you've ever seen
Oh
those.
yeah, yeah.
And it's like, and I love those. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, that's probably why I enjoy this so much, or even consulting with different brands, because it's like every brand, there's a way to success. There's a path to success. So
Hmm,
whether
hmm.
that's the exit phase or just, a year or two into business. So it's kind of like that puzzle, but in the business form of like, all right, what do you have? Where are we trying to go? How can we get there? So it is actually very, very enjoyable. And you get the luxury of working with, like you said, everybody that's made it. Like if they're selling their business at that point,
Hmm.
they've made it to some level. I mean, anybody who's been around business long enough knows that not every business succeeds.
Right, right.
So
Yeah. So that's a really good point. Yep.
But no, that was good. I'm glad we walked through that. And I think that was a great idea doing the 4-part series of the blog articles. And I know we were talking the other day of what you got coming out next, and I don't want to spoil it here, but I think this is great format and kind of, putting the pen to paper, writing it out, and then in hopping on here and kind of walking through it with some examples and really enjoying it. And hopefully our listeners are as well.
Yeah, the listeners, that's who we do it for. I mean, I love talking about the anecdotes too, and I have in mind, like even as I discuss just factual things about, the pros and cons of selling a company, I can remember those situations. They stick out that, a lot of times it's, PTSD,
Yeah,
but
right.
but honestly, having a very high success rate in closing transactions, like you said, you just you find a way to win. And that's what's exciting. That's what I really like, because there's always people involved. You're always trying to, make people happy and do the best that you can.
It's like a law book. You look at it and it's like every rule written in there, every law, or it was written by because somebody did that. Like when you look at a battery and it says don't drink the acid,
No.
somebody tried that. So it's like looking at one of
Hmm.
your articles and like pros and cons, it's like I'm sure there's a,
Yeah,
a complex multi-million-dollar transaction that was tied to every one of those bullet points or those
man.
talking
And
points.
hours of discussion, and you're as much a business psychologist in some cases as you are a financial advisor.
Yeah, you get to wear multiple hats. So,
Yeah.
but and that's truthfully why I guess one of the things that we really, really enjoyed about working with you, because you are like, if something goes wrong, we're calling you, or if we don't understand, so you are the psychologist, you're the advisor, you definitely got to wear a lot of different hats when you're going through that phase, because it's a complex and stressful time period for somebody who's never done it before.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that's why, but there's a relationship that's built through that. It's kind of built in the trenches, it's built through a lot of hard work and a lot of hours. And I've got a long list of contacts and clients that are always saying they'd be happy for others to call them if they ever needed a reference. And so that's great. I like that.
Well, good. And I know the other day you were just saying you had some buyers actually reaching out there, where they're actually starting to look for businesses again, where kind of the market's, coming
Yeah.
back possibly a little bit.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing. The market is strengthening. Um, the capital has been there's capital creation and fund formation, and has always been occurring. And I think there's always a lot of money ready to be put to work, but the timing of taking the risks goes on and off. And I feel like we've been through a period of a lot of uncertainty, especially in our country with respect to inflation, higher interest rates. Um, in your sector that you were operating in, consumer products, there was a bit of a reversion after a big run up after COVID. And I think you have people popping out now. We're ready to take more risk again. And it's nice to have that inbound inquiry about, from buyers looking for good assets.
Right. No, that's good. And if somebody listening, sellers or buyers for that matter, want to get
Mhm.
in touch with you, what's the best way to do it?
Please always feel free to email me. My email address is chris at ofimpactadvisors.com. And then, just coming to our website, there's a contact us form there. There's also some more information you can read about us on the website. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, awesome. That sounds good. And it was great going over this today. I appreciate it. And we'll look forward to the next one.
Absolutely.
All
Thanks a
right.
lot.
See you,
All
Chris.
right. Bye.